In Chapter 8, Mexican Americans from Colonized Minority to Political Activist, you will learn about the early Indian-Spanish relations, the Texas frontier, the conflicts in the borderlands, Mexican immigration, and the Native reactions, as well as the Mexican American civil rights movement. The southwestern or borderlands region of the United States, where the Mexican American population is concentrated, was settled by people of the Spanish Mexican Indian ancestry long before it was inhabited by Anglo-Americans. Along with the American Indian, the Mexican Americans came into society through direct conquest of the place that was their home, their homelands. The Spanish Mexicans are not an immigrant group. This was their home. The three main ideologies of assimilation cannot be applied. We must argue that the Mexican American experience should utilize an anti-assimilationist ideology and framework. We need to begin by questioning whether the immigrant minorities have ever assimilated into precisely 3 generations as the model generally suggests. The colonial model assumes that people of color in America share many of the same experiences of the conquered people in third world nations. Colonized minorities were from the area they were forced to join. Mexicans were used for cheap labor and controlled labor, like the African slaves that were brought here. The Mexicans were expected to occupy the bottom of the employment market. In 1848, the Mexican Americans living in the United States were part of a larger population known as La Raza that shared a complicated heritage. They were not only from the Spanish culture, but also from the Aztec, the Inca, the Maya, and the Toltec cultures. Alvarez in 1985 called this group of Mexican Americans the creation generation. This group had not decided to leave their native land and come to the United States. They woke up one day and discovered that by mutual agreement between the U.S. and Mexico at gunpoint, that is, as the text states, the place where they lived was no longer in Mexico. We didn't cross the border crossed us. Let's take a look at the early Indian-Spanish relations. The Spaniards first landed in Mexico during the first or the second decade of the 16th century and set themselves up as the dominant European Christian group. The monarchy in Spain just wanted to get a hold of land and precious metals. The Catholic Church just wanted to save the heathens' souls. The relationship between the English and the Indians were predominantly hostile. The relations between the Spaniards and the Indians in Mexico were hostile as well. The Spaniards were a little more successful than the Anglo-Americans in converting the Indians to Christianity. We also know that the Indians in the Mexican society were at the very bottom. They provided most of the manual labor to build the haciendas and exploited the riches of the earth. Because there were no clear boundaries when the U.S. secured Louisiana from France, this created constant tensions in the frontier. In Mexico, the melting pot process of assimilation was more significant because by the time Mexico achieved independence in 1821, the culture and population of Mexico had become more Indianized than had their culture and population in the United States. As stated before, the Louisiana Purchase of 1803 did not give a detailed description of the boundaries of the territory. Many Americans believe that Texas definitely had been included in the purchase. However, the Spaniards and the Mexican government said no. Consequently, there were tensions. When we look at the Texas frontier, the U.S. disputed Spain's claim to the east part of Texas until 1819, when Spain and the United States completed a treaty giving Florida to the United States and Texas to Spain. Mexico was successful in gaining independence in 1821 from Spain. Meanwhile, Americans were pushing the frontier to the west, and they became involved in conflicts with Mexico. The Americans, as usual, considered themselves to be racially better than the Mexicans. The majority of the Mexico's citizens were Indians or Spanish Indians or mestizos. In 1836, Texas broke away from Mexico to establish the Independent Republic of Texas. The Tejanos and the Anglo-Americans established and maintained a basis for immigrant cooperation by leaders from both sides. Santa Anna warned that actions incorporating Texas with the United States, that Mexico would consider that an act of war. Well, in 1846, President Polk claimed that Mexico had invaded our territory and that Americans had shed blood on American soil. So he asked Congress for a declaration of war against Mexico. Abraham Lincoln disagreed. Then, in 1848, Mexico surrendered nearly one-half of the territory of Mexico. The Rio Grande became the established boundary between Mexico and the United States. The terms of this surrender is known as the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. The Spanish-Mexican Indian group that lived in that area north of the Rio Grande, an estimated 75,000 to 100,000 natives, were now a conquered minority or a conquered group. As individuals, they could keep their Mexican citizenship or they could become United States citizens. They had to affirm their intentions to stay or after a year become U.S. citizens. Either way, they were seen as defeated and inferior. They began to lose their influence and property as the white people began to move into the area. Their rights were not taken seriously. These folks did not leave their native land. They no longer lived in Mexico. This was not their own land or their own choice. It was by joint agreement. They became known as the Creation Generation. For this group, if they wanted to continue to be Mexican, they would need to move south of the Rio Grande. Only about 2,000 Mexicans actually moved back into what now is Mexico. Most others stayed in what they considered their land. The treaty did not end the violence in the borderlands, so between 1859 and 1873, there were a variety of violent events along the border. One of the most famous was the Cortina Wars. Juan Cheno Cortina led some of those daring exploits. For almost 50 years after the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, very few Mexicans moved to the United States. Many moved back and forth mainly to work. No records were actually kept on this movement. The first major federal law restricting immigration wasn't enacted until 1882. America pretty much had an open-door policy, and we know that the Border Patrol did not begin operations until 1924, and the main focus was against the Chinese. Mexican nationals could enter simply by getting permission at the border station. Beginning in 1904, a quick growth of agriculture, mining, transportation, and construction in the Southwest required a huge labor market. Anglo-Americans took advantage of the Mexican labor force by hiring workers and supplying housing at high fees. They cut costs by providing substandard facilities. The kids of the Mexican immigrant families worked in unsafe, back-breaking labor, and they did not get paid adequately, and they missed a lot of school. The need for workers picking melons, tomatoes, oranges, cotton, and other crops increased and persuaded Mexico to come across the border to work. In the late 1920s, the United States discontinued giving out permanent visas at the border and required Mexicans coming across to go to the American consulate. This had an effect on Mexicans coming over to the United States. Many people preferred to cross the border illegally to avoid the cost of waiting at the border and maybe not even getting across. Once getting across, they were fugitives and they were in no position to insist that they be treated fairly, and many fell victim to discriminatory acts. Life became harsher. There was a dramatic reduction in the flow of Mexicans into the United States in 1929, partly due to the financial crises. There was a sharp fall off of jobs, and many groups wanted to cut the cost of the government welfare, so they began to deport Mexicans. Mexicans who were naturalized citizens were deported regularly, along with Mexicans that were not here legally. This is called repatriation. In many cases, families were broken apart, similar to what is happening now when one parent is sent home while the American-born children remain in this country. American citizens of Mexican descent witnessed that they were not accepted as citizens. American citizens they perceived that when there was a shortage of workers, Mexicans were welcomed. However, when times were bad, like most recently, Americans want Mexicans to go back to where they came from, presumably to go back to Mexico. With the United States at war during World War II, there was a shortage of workers. Mexico and the United States government negotiated a guest worker program for farm workers. Mexico insisted on strict protections. However, many problems arose. One of the biggest was that ranchers found that they could save time and money by employing undocumented workers rather than braceros, and many Mexican workers found it to be more convenient to be undocumented. What happened was you had both undocumented and braceros working in the same fields and getting different incomes. Many Mexican Americans and Mexicans faced acts of discrimination that the Mexican government protested. The bracero program was brought to an end in 1943 after several acts of discrimination prompted the Mexican government to stop the program in Texas. Discrimination against Mexican Americans was not limited to Texas. One of the several alarming events occurred during the summers of 1942 and 1943. The Sleepy Lagoon trial. 22 young men from a street gang were arrested and charged with conspiracy to commit murder. 3 of these young men were convicted of first-degree murder, 9 were convicted of second-degree murder, and 5 were convicted of lesser offenses, and 5 were acquitted. The convictions were thrown out because the trial was conducted in a biased and irregular manner. These young men served nearly 2 years in prison. Then, from June 3rd to the 13th in 1943, the Zoot Suit riots occurred. There was a series of mob attacks by off-duty policemen and U.S. servicemen that were directed at young Mexican Americans who called themselves pachucos, and they wore zoot suits. This uniqueness displayed by the Mexican American youth showed their pride in their heritage of being Mexican Americans and their resentment of the racism they faced. In many instances, the servicemen removed the suits off their victims and ripped them apart. Despite the acts of discrimination that many of our Mexican American youth were subjected to, many were eager to fight for the United States and to prove their loyalty. Many served and died. The first Congressional Medal of Honor awarded to a drafted enlistment during World War II went to Jose P. Martinez of Los Angeles. There was a total of 39 Mexican Americans that received this honor. When they returned, many Mexican American veterans were shocked. They returned to the same, or to the face, I should say, to face the same discrimination and racism that they thought that they had left behind. Mexican American veterans and their families launched a phase of the civil rights movement. In 1929, the League of United Latin American Citizens, LULAC, was formed. The leaders of LULAC felt that it was their duty to develop true and loyal citizens in the United States. They stressed the elimination of discrimination and the need to assimilate. There were other organizations like the United Farm Workers Union, the UFW, organized by Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta, who fought for farm worker rights, and the Mexican American Legal Defense and Educational Fund, MALDEV, that was established in 1967. They kicked off legal actions against segregation of Mexican American students in schools. There were several important cases which rendered changes. These efforts served as advocates for Mexican American interests. Some of these cases included the U.S. versus Texas bilingual, Plyler versus Doe, Edgewood versus Kirby. They registered voters and helped reduce barriers to assimilation. This also helped to enhance ethnic identity and a sense of community among the Mexican Americans. Which leads to a question at the end of this chapter as well. How have Mexican Americans resisted assimilation?